Richard, I'd like to start with you. Siemens Energy is involved in many hydrogen projects worldwide. We've got the US, Germany, Argentina, just some of the few. We know that Namibia and neighboring South Africa have big plans on this front, and I'd like to explore this more with you. Many African countries seem like ideal candidates for the rollout of such clean energy. In which nations do you see opportunities for this energy generation technology, and what makes these countries good contenders?
So, I think the opportunity is all over. So, and I think part of the problem that we have over here is we look at Africa and say, what's Africa? Well, it's not Africa, it's individual countries. And each country is a little bit different, and we've got to make sure that we're looking at them. So when you look at the coast and you see a lot of wind opportunities, maybe in the center you see more solar, and then all those, so when you create the renewable energy, then you can take that renewable energy and turn it into hydrogen. And you not only just hydrogen, you turn it into green hydrogen, which is the way that we want to go. So we're open for all areas, and I think renewables can be reached as well as natural gas through a lot of Africa, and that can be eventually turned into hydrogen. And once you're into hydrogen, you've got so many more opportunities, whether you're using it for solar, for ammonia purposes, e-gasoline, e-methanol. There's so much opportunity once you get it into the base hydrogen side.
Absolutely. Hydrogen is just one of these renewable options. We know many African nations are taking advantage of technologies to harness wind and solar for power generation. How does a country choose which one to go for? I'm a big believer in all the above. Don't bet on one area, because if you bet on one area, you put all your eggs in that one basket. Mm-hmm. So if you're looking at all these different areas and looking at all the opportunities, some are going to be winners and some are going to be losers. But you've got to be in all the above. Otherwise, you've limited your choices going forward. Mm-hmm. I'd like to extend the conversation now to Mike. Mike, you've got very deep experience in helping companies in Africa deploy renewable energy. I'd like to ask you, what policies do African nations need to develop to attract this innovation technology? What hindrances need to be removed?
Yeah, thanks very much. So, we're looking at a landscape globally where energy is decarbonizing and decentralizing. Finally, with renewables, you can produce power where it's consumed, and this trend can happen fastest in Africa because of distributed populations, because of distributed industry. And I think we need to move this debate from SDG 7, affordable and clean energy, and really look at this as boosting productivity, accelerating growth, SDG 8, decent work and economic growth. And so where we focus is in this commercial and industrial space, and how can decentralized hybrid power, wind, solar, storage, hydrogen empower these businesses, which will create the jobs and economic growth and stability in so many African countries. And I think the policies that need to be looked at are how can we solve issues on the supply chain, so reducing duties. Nigeria is 20% on energy storage, for instance. How can we incentivize more young people to upskill into electricians, into solar developers? This is capacity building, and that can be very collaborative. It's an area we work in. And if we can solve that, and if we can bring more finance into this space, because diesel is cheap up front, expensive long term, and fuel prices are up 100%. Whereas renewable energy is always this upfront investment. And so far we've seen some really exciting developments, Exim Bank, for instance, with utility scale projects. But how can we get low cost Western finance into this commercial industrial space?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You talk about decentralization, and Siemens, you need a grid to do your work. In places with established distribution grids like in South Africa, connecting these new projects to existing power distribution infrastructure has proven difficult because the existing grid isn't necessarily able to accommodate this. So there's this inability to harness the benefits of the green transition in some places. What policies do you see as being necessary to facilitate this?
So when you hit the nail on the head, because everybody likes to talk about generation. Generation is the new sexy side of the business, but everything needs to be connected from one generation source to where it's being needed. So the policies that we needed are, first of all, permitting to make sure that as you move across countries, and boundary layers and different from one state to the next, that the permitting gets opened up. And we see that not only just in Africa, we see it extensively in North America as well. And people can't go ahead without projects because of permitting. So that becomes probably one of the major boundaries. But also, people don't really like to talk about transmission, that infrastructure. Infrastructure is a problem globally, and we've got to make sure that we're focusing on that. Otherwise, we're going to end up with really good renewable resources that can't connect to the market. And that's a dangerous place to be.
William, Regrow Ag has developed software that helps food producers, General Mills, Cargill, among some of them, to reduce their carbon footprints with software and soil crop modeling. There are many examples of successful agricultural enterprise throughout the continent, cocoa in West Africa, tea in the East, but there's no doubt that there's room for a lot more. With 60% of the world's arable land in Africa, in some instances, it could perhaps be done more sustainably, keeping the quality of soil, for example, in mind as well. What else does the continent need to do to unlock the vast potential that it has in an ecologically responsible way?
Yeah, thank you. I think the key issue is to recognize the variability in agricultural production systems across the continent. The differences in the climate regimes, soils will dictate different opportunities for improving resilience of these production systems and potentially creating climate benefits. So agriculture is at the center target of climate change, right? Resilience is something that we need to build. In Africa, roughly 60% of the lands are degraded. So there are opportunities to use scientific innovations and data innovations to connect outcomes for adaptation, reversal of degradation, and by sequestering carbon, improving nutrient cycling, that actually can be funded through blended finance, both public sector finance, but also corporates that are making their science-based targets that interact with the supply chain in Africa. So I think we really need to recognize that agriculture is heterogeneous and that the interventions to create these outcomes need to be specific to a locale, to the technical assistance that's required to help farmers make that journey into a more regenerative production system, and to create financial incentives to connect those outcomes with the supply chain, because that's where the finance will come from, both through public but also private sector finance. We're seeing strong interest from global corporate commitments for their science-based targets to help incentivize this transition. And the co-benefits that come with it: improves soil health, soil carbon, reduces risk of yield losses, and creates a more resilient economy for farmers and globally as well.
Okay. Bill and also Mike, both of you have touched on this. Financing. Financing is key. How are things evolving? Are you seeing more of a take-up in interest in developing projects on the continent?
Yeah, absolutely. So, Washington, D.C. is home to a major energy service company, which is financing C&I assets. With telecom towers, where you have very bankable counterparties, and yet, requirements for off-grid infrastructure, we've seen a lot of activity. But I think, to really look at economic empowerment, to go beyond, enabling connectivity, everyone talks about local banks, high interest rates. I think that we need to look at how digitalization, how real data of these sites and payment ratios and so on can drive greater institutional interest. So we don't just have a few fragmented startups, funding these independent C&I projects, whether it's mines or factories or agro-processors, but large funds and DFIs coming into this. And perhaps, as has happened with energy access products, offering subsidies.
Okay. Would you like to talk about that as well?
Yeah, I think on the ag side, I think there's a rethinking of international development programs and pivoting away from what is often thought of as a push mechanism where you bring in resources to do X, Y, or Z. I think in ag, given the heterogeneity of the landscape and local knowledge, that really needs to think about more incentive-based programs that reward the outcomes, which is what the incentives are for, and takes advantage of innovation at the local level where agriculture matters. So I think in terms of the public finance, that's a new mechanism that I think will create innovation that's applicable to different agricultural landscapes. I also think on the corporate side, the private side, we need to be able to connect the outcomes with the assets that are generated to mobilize investment from the private sector. And I think, advancements in technologies, remote sensing technologies, data science technologies, blockchain can begin to get over that barrier, which is connecting the farmers and their farmers' outcomes to the end users along that value chain. And I think that will unlock significant private finance once we figure out how to get over that barrier.
Mm-hmm. How can governments facilitate this?
I think technical assistance, helping with co-finance in terms of changing these systems. It's difficult to change agricultural systems that have been in place for long periods of time, and there's technical assistance that needs to be there. There needs to be some sort of risk management. We're asking growers to adjust their practices, and sometimes the yield resilience and economic benefits take some time to actually manifest themselves because of the processes when going from a very degraded system to a more healthy soil system takes time. Mm-hmm. And so that has to be de-risked through both public and private finance, mm-hmm. I think.
And I have the same question for you, Mike, on the energy side. Government involvement, how can they help facilitate this?
So if you look at energy access, whether through solar home systems or mini grids, all these rural electrification agencies, other government ministries would manage these World Bank budgets for subsidies. And a lot of this is demand driven. So I think if you move this conversation from sort of rural energy access to economic growth and to business empowerment, the main cost base for most commercial industrial is electricity. They can reduce that cost base, if they can move away from diesel to renewable energy, then I think it's about instigating this conversation with organizations like World Bank and developing subsidies for, as has happened in the West, of course, for the deployment of renewable energy or subsidies for financing this, really kickstart this interest in the commercial space. There has been a lot of recent interest in carbon credits, mm-hmm. and it's worth noting that the CO2 displacement is very real here. You're not displacing hydro usually. You're displacing very dirty diesel from inefficient generators. And I think if that can be incorporated into some of these government policies, perhaps that carbon credits are required to claim subsidies, then that could spur a greater investment.
Mm-hmm. And what about the international financial institutions and the role that they're playing? How can that improve?
I think there's a lot of enthusiasm for this. And whether it's World Bank, IFC, I was at Exim yesterday, and there's so much interest in American technology and American capacity, helping with this energy transition. But also, there needs to be this clear demand from African governments and ministers that this is what we want to tackle, and this is how we want to shape that fund or that policy.
Mm-hmm. How can, excuse me.
Well, we're at the core of this U.S.-Africa Leader Summit, so hopefully there'll be lots of conversations happening around this. But I think it would be productive if there's a focus on what businesses need in terms of power support, as opposed in addition to households and rural communities.
Just given the low percentage of Africa's R&D funding, how can international companies help support the continent? I'd like to start with you, please, Rich.
Yeah, and at Siemens Energy, we say we can't do it alone. We wish we could do it alone, but we can't. So it's about partnerships, and it's real partnerships. It's not a one-sided, lopsided partnership. So I think when I look at what we do with some of our academia, we'll just last week we said with Georgia Tech, and those are the type of things that, with companies tying with governments, tying with academia, then academia tying with other academia. So, African colleges tying up with the U.S. colleges, putting that together, building on other, not saying, oh, we're going to go in competition with each other. Now it's about collaboration. It's about building on top of each other. And we've got to get away from this this competition of, I'm going to write a better paper than you, I'm going to make more money than you.
we're here for a purpose. We've got to stand on each other's shoulders, and that's the way we get to the right place.
Mm-hmm. The same question for you, please, Bill. With R&D, how can this be improved?
I think from the ag sector perspective, there's ongoing action to really think about what are the appropriate varieties or cultivars for a given crop in a given locale. Understanding how the genotype of different varieties influence the outcomes based on the environmental conditions and the management practices. So this concept of G by E by M, which is bringing together the seed producers that breed for certain genotype characteristics of the varieties that are applicable to the different geographies across the broad landscape in Africa. That science is starting to come together, but it's also merging with the understanding of the geospatial nature of environmental drivers that influence productivity, yield loss, pest management risks. That needs to be taken into account. Again, bringing together maybe public sector geospatial data from space agencies like NASA, ESA, and private sector space agencies that can really help understand the variability across Africa. And then lastly, and this is where the technical assistance piece comes in, is the management lever, right? So you have a good seed stock that's appropriate for a particular crop in a particular locale. You know the environmental risk from it. You need to also de-risk it through appropriate management interventions. So there's partnerships along that whole supply chain from the seed providers, input providers, technical assistance providers in a locale. You need to bring all that information together to sort of de-risk yield impacts of climate change.
Absolutely. And the same question for you, Mike, on R&D. How can international companies help support this? What can we do to incentivize that?
Yeah, so if you look at this rich ecosystem of ambitious startups in Nairobi, in Lagos, across all sectors from fintech to, transforming so many industries, I'm not sure there is a strong foreign company requirement. I mean, in our space, in the energy transition, it would be great to have more capacity building so that Nigerian students, for instance, aren't brain drained and aren't applying for student visas, and that some of this core electrical engineering could be distributed, this knowledge. But I think actually maybe the best way to spur innovation is for foreign companies to hire more of these developers or to use these startup products. I mean, we're recruiting in Ghana, Kenya, and Nigeria, and the talent pool is phenomenal. And so these, self-taught. It's not as formalized education system generally, but in digitalization, in software and electronics, I think perhaps foreign companies should look at more what they can learn from these great engineers rather than what they can bring.
Exactly.
And if I may just sort of jump on that, I love your comment about startups, because as a larger company, we sort of look at startups and we kind of look down our noses at startups. And we've got to take a bit of humble pie and go, man, those startups can bring so much to the party. And there's things that we as a larger company can bring to the party as well. And if we really have that humbleness and respect, we can really take this to the next level. And we partner through Breakthrough Energy with a lot of startups. And that's exciting to see what they bring. And we bring an ability and a knowledge on how to scale their product. We also bring the knowledge of what the industry have and who the customers are. And they bring that great entrepreneurial spirit that we've kind of lost over the years. So really working in that partnership. And you bring in the universities, because the universities really have the great view to who the great startups are as well. And we've seen a lot of successes, and we need to drive more and more of that as an industry.
Absolutely. I think that's a lovely note on which we can end this panel. Thank you so much for your participation. I'd like to thank our panelists for their insights.